Hello! Welcome to Building Perspective, the new World Green Building Council series, where I'm going to be discussing the future of the global sustainable built environment movement with the leaders that are forging the way. So throughout the year, we will be inviting these great personalities to share their expertise and also find ways to collaborate and discuss top-of-mind sustainability challenges that we face as a sector. We hope to hear the human stories behind their successes and how they are working to catalyze sustainable buildings for everyone everywhere. My name is Cristina Gamboa. I'm the CEO of the World Green Building Council. And with us today, we have Davina Rooneys. She is the CEO of Green Building Council of Australia. Davina has been leading GBCA since June 2019, and her organization is leading Australia's sustainable built environment movement. And it's really an honor to hear from her today about her unique building perspective. So thank you, Davina, so much for joining us today. How are you?
Oh, I'm fantastic, Cristina. Thank you so much for having me. And I really love the concept of the series where, we pull behind the covers for the gorgeous conversations that you and I get to have and, different, CEOs within the World Green Building Council network and make those far more available.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time. So I would like to start for me to ask you some questions around your personal leadership, because I think the signature of a leader also brings great results, and that's what we're seeing as a movement. So from your own journey, Davina, right, what could you share with our audience in terms of the types of attributes or qualities that you feel are necessary for sustainable leadership?
Look, one of the things that I really enjoy at the moment is there's a construct of management thinking about authentic leadership, which is, honesty, transparency. And I think that's really necessary because when we talk about the sustainability challenges, they're vast and some of them are quite confronting. And we often have to map a path where we don't know all the answers. We know where the lighthouse on the hill is, we know where we are, and we know where a few of the next steps are. But I think some of these, authentic leadership constructs where we're just really honest about where we are, I think they're really important. So I think it's a combination of humility, courage, and really transparency, that real authenticity that's fundamental for leading in these times. But also a tremendous compassion because, so many of the wonderful people within sustainability are very values aligned and, how we support them on their journey is really one of the legacies that we leave.
Totally. I love those words. The courage, the compassion goes down to humans and connections, right? And so I guess going into climate action, we know it's the year and the decade of delivering meaningful mitigation solutions. And of course, it's about resiliency. Could you share a little bit on that climate leadership? What does it look like? What other words come to mind to describe that type of leadership?
So when we look at climate leadership, I think that there's a few aspects that it's really important to talk about. So I think the first aspect of leadership is leading in the things we know how to do now. So the World Green Building Council Net Zero Buildings Challenge, where we take highly efficient buildings and we power them by renewables. We know how to do that now. So I think leadership now looks like taking that to absolute scale. But I think the other aspect is, as we unpack the complex area of embodied carbon, it's about setting the lighthouse on the hill, which WorldGBC has done so well. Net zero 2050, 40% down by 2030, and then doing really tangible work with industry to create the business case. So, I think as organisations, that's what leadership looks like. I think for green building councils, it's really about mapping a pathway for others to follow. And so I think leadership from a green building council is different. I think I frequently reference the carrot, the stick and the tambourine. So I think the carrot is the green ratings that many of us around the world, be it Green Star, which we run, or LEED, or whichever system in the country you're in, is about. That's the carrot. The stick is about how we work with regulation to make sure that as the leaders lead, we lift it up so all the boats rise. And then the tambourine of how we create excitement and noise, you know, to keep everyone on that journey is global leadership programs like the one that you run, the World Green Building Council Net Zero Challenge. So I think leadership from a Green Building Council is accepting that this is a really long journey. And so creating engagement along the way, both taking the leaders and everyone with us.
I want to take you back in time because preparing for this interview, we got to learn that you spent like 8 months in the Indian Himalayas on a construction of a multi-award winning school. So could you please share what you wanted to achieve and how this influenced your personal leadership and journey when you were coming into the green building movement?
Oh, I learned so much on the Druk White Lotus School. So I was working for His Holiness, the 12th Galwang Drukpa, who's the local religious leader within Ladakh. And so I came to this project. I had the privilege I started my early career working for Arup and in Sydney, worked for Arup Associates in London. And one of their community projects was in the Indian Himalayas. And I just learnt so much. So it was, you know, such a fun project. It featured in a Bollywood movie. So, you know, there's that fun side of things. But I had this privilege of working in a location where there were like monks and Rinpoches involved. And I received so many life lessons that it took me a number of years to understand and later process. I remember a key moment where something went wrong on site and, you know, I was shoveling dirt because we had all these VIPs coming and, you know, we'd managed to have a problem with the garden and I was doing the last minute corrections and, you know, one of the Rinpoches came over and sort of went, energy high, bring it down. And at the time, I wasn't ready for his leadership lesson and kind of smiled sweetly, hurried him out of the way and kept shoveling dirt. But the thing that he was trying to tell me is, yes, I could do those activities, but I didn't need to waste so much energy expending, huffing and puffing around it. And I think that's been such an instrumental lesson for me about many of us in sustainability. We try to position ourselves in like this fuse role where we try to connect two sides that aren't talking to each other well, and we try and create ourselves as a fuse joining these sides. And that's important, but if you burn too hot, you blow yourself out.
We are heading into 2021 as we speak today. What are your priorities for this year? GBCA has hit a landmark of 3,000 certifications, and that's fantastic. And building on that, what are you focusing on and what do you want to achieve this year?
We are in a tremendous hurry, and to be frank, we need to be, because the change we're talking about, you know, genuinely needs to be scaled. So, you know, we're embarking on a huge digital transformation to digitize the back end of our tools as part of our customer experience. But at the end, what I'm most excited about is that'll lead to a democratization of data. You know, so many of us in the green building movement spend a lot of time with archaic databases, carefully assessing buildings, but we haven't been able to make everything available to be researched to its full extent. So there's a huge opportunity there. We're really heavily leaning into the sustainability megatrends and what they tell us the space is for existing buildings and what they mean for the sustainable development goals, which we're embedding in all of our tools at the moment. And we're spending a lot of time with our members and partners really looking at the circular economy and imagining how we take that and thread that through all of our work and use that to imagine the future. So there are a couple of the headlines. There's a whole lot of detail that goes beneath that. But we headline this as one of our biggest years. We turn 20 next year. And so, there's going to be a huge build up to ensure that we deserve our birthday party.
Say we lived a 2020 that was not expected by anyone. We learned some things. Now we're going in a moment where sustainability as a trend is accelerating. How can leaders focus and refocus to convey others to join us in this in this journey?
So I think we got a number of things out of 2020, but I think one of the most important ones was the sustainability movement over the last 20 years has struggled to explain vulnerability. So when we look at the World Economic Forum's top risks, climate change has been up there for a long time, biodiversity loss, extreme weather events. But you know what was at the bottom of that list? A pandemic. Equally ignored, equally misunderstood. Now, COVID has forced local, and global changes at a scale that we couldn't imagine, and, rapid scaling and sharing of opportunities, and has helped us to partner in ways that we couldn't see possible. So this really shows what can be achieved when we have a consensus on a risk that has a global scale and impacts. So I think for many of the climate leaders out there who, have been fighting this fight for a really long time and have been struggling because, let's face it, it's been a pretty hard decade where things haven't been going in the direction we want. I think we should almost look ourselves as the vaccine producers. At the moment, we're working out the detail of the solutions and looking at how we scale them. And there's a genuine opportunity for us to globally take those at scale. And in this case, I really, have to commend the World Green Building Council on, your partnership getting ready for COP and looking at how we get a Buildings and Cities Day. So that's a really clear and tangible example of how we scale all the small pieces of work, scale them at country level, then work together to scale them internationally and profile at scale what the opportunities look like, and if we all lean in, how we can design a better future. And so I think one of the challenges for those who, like us in Australia, experienced the horror bushfires of our time and then went straight into a pandemic, sometimes the world needs to see these things to be ready for the message that you've been pushing for a long time.
Totally. And that actually is a good leeway to what I wanted to ask you next. And it's about the challenges of the Asia Pacific region, right? Because Australia is doing great work under your leadership in terms of pushing forward, that relationship of business being great advocates and leaders and really applying best practice, also inspiring governments to follow suit with great advocacy work you also do, and beating the tambourine that we talked about. But in general, in other countries in Asia Pacific, Davina, the sense that I have, and I would like to know your opinion, is that some other countries are a bit slower. They're maybe a little bit more conservative, and that vulnerability that you're talking about maybe has not hit them yet. Maybe there's a little bit more of awareness in the times we're living, but it kind of feels it's a conservative region for uptake of best practice. So with that introduction, I would like to know, what do you think? What's the biggest challenge ahead for Australia, but also for the Asia Pacific, and how do you connect the dots of also bringing others along?
So I think one of the biggest challenges for Australia is we're very fortunate we have some of the global building leaders here. However, when you look at the global review of our climate policy, we have work to do. So the biggest challenge for us is getting, scaled long-term targets that many of the leaders are adopting in this sector and really scaling those through sensible policy. I think with the Asia Pacific region, it's so complex and nuanced that there's so many different stories that it's really hard to generalize. But, Cristina, I take your point that it's felt like people weren't ready to see that vulnerability, but I think that's up till 2020. I think 2020 is a really seminal year, and I think my call to leadership is to reimagine what that looks like with recent experiences. And like any emerging market, when we look at what the leaders, focused on in our market first, it was things that were driven by a really strong financial business case. And then they built momentum from there. So I'd encourage anyone who's working through items in that region to really drive from those areas. but I genuinely have to acknowledge the leadership that we're seeing out of that region, and it inspires me.
Yeah, it's great stuff. So going into advocacy, Davina, I would like to ask you, you spoke a little bit about this previously, but of course there is business leadership, but we need government leadership. And I guess to meet the climate targets, we need that ambition loop. So what can be done? What's your vision, your aspiration of what's needed in Australia? So there's a positive feedback loop into what business is driving forward. What are your key 3 asks from a advocacy perspective?
So my key 3 asks would be, we launched a net zero document, Every Building Counts, with our property council partners in Australia, with one of our federal ministers. And essentially it was, how do you decarbonise at a federal, state and local level? And so the first thing we'd ask is the adoption of a net zero target, and starting to implement that pathway would be the first thing. The second thing that we'd really ask for is government leadership. It's some of the biggest procurement levers we have. And, so in our market, government takes up approximately 30% of all office space. So when we actually moved the procurement guidelines, which started, 15 years ago in this space with the energy efficiency government operations, but we have an opportunity to pull those levers a lot harder and drive market change. And then the third that I'd ask for is a little bit of a symbiotic relationship that we're seeing, that when we work with our members and the leaders achieve something, that clears space for the regulators to lift the bar. And so that's something that we've worked in broadly, but we're starting to be enormously targeted in that space. So, for example, we're launching and finalising the Net Zero Residential Leaders Program in the middle of this year, right at the time that government's putting their new policies out for advocacy. And so what we're trying to say is, if the leaders can do it now, why can't you regulate in that space? And we've deliberately aligned and used the frameworks to create a pathway for better, and deliberately trying to train the supply chain in that space to make more space. So I think there's a real opportunity to look at the symbiotic relationship between voluntary pathways creating space for policy, or advocacy in action, as I call it.
That's so inspiring. And I guess, Davina, and what are the three business learnings as a GBC CEO that you could share with our network for others to leapfrog and continue to thrive in this space?
So my key leadership learnings have been taking care of people always matters. One of the challenges when we deal with the big challenges is that, it can almost seem like it gets in the way, or it's something we'll do later. Taking care of yourself, your team, working with partners. In our first phase of the pandemic, we spent our time just calling members and asking, are you okay? And sometimes we were the first one internally or externally to do that, even, as it all came down. So 2 would be connect to the strategy, connect to the global sustainability megatrends, because it all starts there. So whichever framework you look at, it really comes from the global megatrends around carbon, health and well-being, circular economy. They're really the long-term, as they relate to the Sustainable Development Goals, TCFD. They're the drivers of change in our space, and they influence the frameworks, whether it be Dow Jones Sustainability Index, GRESB, whichever your flavour. The third is, I think if we want to change everything, we need to work with everyone. And so in the business space, it might be finding the what's in it for me, but we need to do more work in the consumer space, so that the sustainability movement needs to have the pulse and the heartbeat of people that are marching on the street about climate change. People need to feel really confident that if they want things to change, the first thing they should be doing is, how do they have a more efficient, healthier, more resilient home, that's efficient, powered by renewables, better for them and their family. We have to get better at taking people's broad concerns and tapping that to the things that they can do today and tomorrow to make that pathway simpler. So there'd be my top three.
Oh, those are wonderful. And yes, that's exactly the sort of messages I think our audience will get so inspired. Thank you so much, Davina, for your time, for sharing your inspiration. I guess, would you maybe share finally one final piece of advice to your fellow CEOs of GBCs worldwide that are also leading in 70 different countries and their geographies in ways that are so inspiring to us all?
Well, I guess one piece of advice is you were chosen as a leader for a reason. You know, often in these challenging times, people can have doubt, but someone saw in you this leadership. And then the last thing I'd say is a thanks. We all need, you know, these are global problems. We need to lean in. We're all in this together, or we're not going to resolve it. So I guess my thanks for everything they do in every day to actually help us work on these global challenges together.
Thank you very much, Davina. And thank you everyone for joining us. And we hope you enjoyed this discussion.